Welcome to iPad Pros. I'm Tim Chen, host of the show. Today on the podcast is Lewis of silverfox.be, creator of Textor, OpenTerm, and Pixure. Lewis has been on a mission to make his iPad more useful to him as a developer, with the goal of one day having the iPad be a primary computer for developers. His first steps into this was creating a TextEdit replacement with Textor and a terminal for iOS with OpenTerm. I'm a huge fan of his work, and without further delay, here's my interview with Lewis of silverfox.be. Enjoy. I'm here today with Lewis of silverfox.be. Welcome, Lewis.
Hi.
So you came across my radar on Twitter, and your apps have been kind of popping into my timeline through all of your different projects you've been working on, and I looked a bit more into what your kind of mission is, and it's to make the iPad your main computer. And as a developer, you have certain tools that normal people do not. So can you kind of go into what tools you've been making to make this a reality for you?
Yeah, sure. So about 3 years ago, I started working on a pixel art editor called Pixure, which was my first productivity iPad app that I made. About a year ago, I created a framework called PanelKit, which sort of took Pixure to the next level. And PanelKit allowed Pixure to have floating panels inside the app. You can drag those around and pin them to a side, and it's kind of like a window manager, but inside an app. That made Pixure a lot more productive. Then some time passed, and I was focusing on some more features for Pixure specifically, and I created some frameworks. But then a couple of months ago, I started working on, what it would take for an iPad to become more useful to me as a developer, because I am an iOS developer mainly. One of the key points that was missing on iOS for me was sort of a terminal, a command line interface. I had this initial vision with the Files app that Apple introduced last year with iOS 11. I thought it would be cool if you could have, in a split screen view, on one side a command line interface manipulating files, and on the other side, the right-hand side, you would have the Files app, which displays the files that you're manipulating. Just a fun idea, and I worked on that for a couple of nights in December of last year. And then in January, I finally released an app called Terminal. It took like 10 days for Apple to realize, maybe we shouldn't allow an app called Terminal on the App Store.
Yeah, I downloaded it when it still had the terminal name. It's like, I can't call it that.
It kind of looked official.
Yeah. People
who didn't know it was unofficial thought, hey, Apple released an app called Terminal. And it was free and had a really similar icon as Terminal on macOS. After 10 days on the App Store, they contacted me and said, well, maybe you should change the name, or we're going to take it down. And then I changed the name to OpenTerm, which puts a nice focus on the fact that the Terminal app, now called OpenTerm, is open source, based obviously on a lot of these commands that it includes are open source, and I made the app itself also open source. Going even further after OpenTerm, I started wondering a command line app is fine, and basically OpenTerm can be described as a glorified file manager, you can think of it, where basically you have these commands that you can type to create files and read files, or create folders and organize your files and maybe search through them, things like that. It surprised me that when you created a TXT file in OpenTerm, that basically on iOS by default, there's no real app to open TXT files and save them. Yeah, because
there's so many text editors, but they're all in some custom format, most of them, and they're very fancy.
Right, indeed. And of course, the Notes app that Apple provides on iOS doesn't really work on a file level. It's like completely locked in, the Notes app. I'm sure underneath the hood, it does use TXT files maybe to some extent, but it's not really accessible to you. And even Pages, which is free from Apple, from the iWork suite, it does allow you to open TXT files, but it doesn't allow you to save them back as TXT files, which is kind of dumb. It basically converts it to a Pages document.
It's been frustrating for a long time just editing in XML. I have a podcast that I still do manual feeds with and XML editing. It was such a pain in the butt. I was using IA Writer, and I was never quite sure if it saved properly as what I needed to be, and
Textor actually does a great job with just XML, because that's, I think, just TXT with a different extension. I'm not positive, though.
A lot of file formats are basically plain text with, a fancy extension which certain applications recognize and give you some syntax highlighting or things like that. So yeah, indeed.
Yeah.
And that's the great thing about Textor. Contrary to a lot of, you could say, the competitors of Textor, these other text editors on iOS, Textor is not just limited to TXT files. It allows you to open basically any text file like XML or even files without an extension, which a lot of apps seem to have trouble opening, sadly enough.
And I love the design of it. It just opens the document picker, and it really is pretty powerful if you're a user of like TextEdit on the Mac. And if you've been using that TextEdit app document folder all this time, you can actually just dive into the TextEdit document app on your iPad and be editing the same documents you do there. And it works really well like that.
Yeah, it really is kind of crazy that TextEdit on macOS supports iCloud. And so if you have iCloud enabled, those files will appear on your iPad in the Files app and your iPhone. But if you tab them, those TXT files, by default, you will be able to view them, I suppose, but not edit them.
Yeah.
Which is really weird, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, at some point, the Files app would be great if you could edit basic stuff like text within the Files app, but I don't see that happening soon.
Mm-hmm.
So with those tools, is there anything else on your radar that's like missing out of the App Store or tool set you have on the iPad to get your work done?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I'm an iOS developer. I work full-time at a company called Next Steps here in Belgium. So my main time on computers is focused on working in an app called Xcode, the IDE that Apple provides on macOS, which is used to create iOS apps. That's the app I spent most of my time in. And obviously, that's not available on iOS at the moment. You can't develop iOS apps on an iPad yet.
Mm-hmm.
There is the Swift Playgrounds app, which allows you to do some small things in Swift on iPad. But that's quite limited at the moment and doesn't really provide features that I need to do any serious work. If I were to really consider an iPad to replace my MacBook Pro, it would have to have Xcode available on it, which it doesn't at the moment.
Do you see that as a possibility in the coming years? I think Apple's starting to get more serious about this stuff.
I really do think, and maybe this year at WWDC or maybe next year, we might see Xcode for iPad or maybe even iPhone, although there is some doubt there.
Yeah.
Which would fill a huge gap for me on iOS at the moment. But even then, there are certain limitations as to the usefulness of an iPad to me, which not necessarily stem in the software, but as well the hardware for some parts.
Yeah.
Which obviously is I can change the hardware of the iPads. That only Apple can do that.
Would you want to see like a 20-inch desktop form factor iPad eventually as something to use at the desk?
It's a tricky wordplay, I suppose, when you say a 20-inch iPad.
I guess the interface would have to be updated quite a bit to maneuver a device at large.
I suppose what I want is a 15-inch kind of laptop form factor which runs iOS. That's perhaps a better description of what I would like to see. And you could call that an iPad or call it a MacBook for all I care, or an iBook. It's really the OS that runs on it. And obviously iOS at the moment wouldn't fully fit on a 15-inch laptop form factor. There are certain system features that it would need.
Is part of that form factor a trackpad with a mouse on the screen, or is it more the clamshell with the bigger battery and slightly bigger screen than the 12-inch?
I suppose once you go beyond like the 12.9-inch iPads that you have as the maximum at the moment, once you go beyond that, it becomes inevitable to rethink the window management on iOS, where basically on iPad currently you're limited to a split screen, where you have two apps on the screen, as well as since iOS 11 last year, you can have a third app floating either left or right. So you can have three apps at the moment. Once you go beyond like 13-inch and you have a 15-inch or even 20-inch, as you've mentioned, device with iOS on it, it would be nice to have a certain window kind of manager like you have on macOS, where you can drag windows around, resize them, and not having to worry about only having the split screen.
Another concept I was thinking about is, how you drag an app to a certain part to have it be put in that kind of place on your iPad as far as the windowing. If you could divide that up further where you have the bottom half of one of your split screens be one app and the top half be another app, that way you could have more to work with,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but again, there are certain concepts on macOS that aren't necessarily wrong. It's just that it would be nice to be able to run iOS on a MacBook-like device.
Yeah.
And so I don't necessarily want to throw away all of the good ideas from macOS if we ever replace macOS with iOS, or some OS that replaces both of them, I suppose.
Right, yeah.
As I've mentioned, PanelKit is also kind of an experiment to see how you could manipulate the resizing and placement of floating panels, but you could call them windows, I suppose, to a certain extent, on a touchscreen device. And so instead of thinking of PanelKit managing the panels inside Pixure, you could apply the same ideas to a system-wide feature, where you might have apps that you can drag around, as you can in Pixure with the panels right now, and you can resize them and pin them to a side, which might be interesting. You mentioned mouse support or trackpad support as well.
One thing I was thinking about is the Apple TV has like a trackpad, and it would make a lot of sense to at least have that kind of interface where you're able to do certain things, maybe not a full mouse, but more Apple TV kind of style of control, perhaps.
Right. So tvOS has this focus-based UI, is what you're talking about.
Yeah,
I think.
Exactly.
I don't think the mouse should necessarily die together with macOS.
Sure, yeah.
I think if you do have let's say we have a 20-inch or even a 27-inch iOS device, or, computer running iOS, like you have an iMac today, imagine that running iOS, then you wouldn't necessarily want to use touch input as the only input.
Sure.
I can imagine that if you have a 27-inch screen, you would probably want that vertical most of the time. And when you have the vertical, your screen, it's getting tiresome to 100% of the time use your finger as an input. And so that would lead you to a trackpad, which is horizontally. And once you have a trackpad, you probably want a mouse. I don't necessarily think iOS should move to a focus-based UI like tvOS does. I'm not sure that scales well to complex productivity apps like an image editor.
Yeah.
And so, it'd be interesting to see mouse support on iOS once you go to larger screen sizes.
Yeah, definitely. I use mice for my remoting application. It supports a Bluetooth mouse, but it's like only that app can work with it kind of thing. So it would be nice to see a system-wide understanding of mice and do it in a way that makes sense for the user.
One last note on that point. Last year, I created a framework called PointerKit, which is kind of funny, which actually was a proof of concept. It's not really used in any apps that I know of, but it's a proof of concept to basically link a Bluetooth mouse, as you described, to an iPad. And I had this demo hooked up to Pixure where you could have a trackpad or a Magic Mouse from Apple, which controls a mouse basically inside Pixure, and you can click things and drag things and things like that. It was kind of funny, and a lot of people seem to like that idea. So hopefully Apple will take a look at that.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that they will expand to larger scale devices eventually, and I think they're moving that way, and hopefully a mouse at some point gets there, if only for, some of those larger form factors. And even, when you're working at a standing desk, I used to stand up more when I worked, but now with an iPad, it's more comfortable to be sitting down and having your, elbow rest near the screen kind of thing. With PanelKit, is it an open source kit? Have you seen other developers take to it yet, or what's the status of that?
So most of the things I do nowadays are open source, luckily, including PanelKit as well as PointerKit, which I mentioned earlier. PanelKit is being used in Pixure, as I mentioned, as well as OpenTerm, which is kind of interesting, where you have a bunch of panels regarding the history of where you've been with your command line interface, and you have bookmarks, and in the coming update you will even have a scripts panel where you can manage your scripts. Apart from my own apps, there have been a couple of apps that I've seen that made it into the App Store with PanelKit. Nothing like real productivity.
Okay.
But hey, if someone listening is interested in using it, please let me know, and I'll take a look. or maybe help out.
With OpenTerm, what limitations did you have to deal with on iOS to create with this? You mentioned its use case of working with files app side by side. Do you have to work only in the OpenTerm app data folder, or are you able to get elsewhere within there?
Obviously, there are a lot of limitations when it comes to building a terminal on iOS that is, not built by Apple, but actually using only the allowed APIs, so it can be in the App Store, so they don't reject it. I suppose the biggest limitation initially that I thought was indeed regarding the file access. If you build an iPad app, by default, you only have access to the files within that app's documents folder.
Mm-hmm.
But I got a way around that by basically enabling OpenTerm to use iCloud. And so the files stored actually on iCloud, and that means you can view them in the Files app. And another great thing is that in iOS 11, or maybe even before that, Apple allowed you to open any folder from a cloud-based provider and actually allow an app to access those documents and manipulate them. You can tap a button in OpenTerm, and you can open any folder that you can see in the Files app. You can, execute any command that you otherwise could on the documents within OpenTerm.
Okay. What's a common directory path you have for, say, Google Drive? Is it /Google Drive / the path, or how do you access them?
Yeah, so you can't actually access a folder on Google Drive via a command.
Okay.
You can't do that. You actually need to bring up basically the Files app, but it's inside OpenTerm. It doesn't really open the Files app, but it looks like it.
And is this using the panel kit? It'll have a panel that's visible, or?
No, it's full screen. It opens a full screen window provided by Apple, a system API, which shows you basically the Files app, where you can select a folder using the UI provided by Apple. Once you select the folder, you can open it, and then you can execute any commands on it. But you cannot escape what's called the sandbox, which is basically, as you have on macOS, there's a lot of files regarding how the system works and the default apps on the system, such as the calendar app and the mail app, things like that. You cannot access those. You can only access files that you can see within the Files app on iPad within OpenTerm.
And once you use that panel to get into a folder, you have access to, through command line, all the files within that app directory or within that storage provider directory, or how far back does it lead you?
Once you select a folder, you only have access to the files within that folder. And I'm actually not sure about subfolders within that folder, because there's some security issues there. So you might need to, if you need to change a folder, you might need to open that files screen again to select another folder.
Okay. And what's the common use case for you when you're doing file management on the iPad, working within these folders to move stuff around?
The interesting thing I think about OpenTerm is it has very little limitations regarding file creation, because basically if you go inside the Files app on iOS at the moment and you want to create a file, like let's say you want to create an XML file that you want to do something in, there's no way to do that. You can create folders, there's a button for that, but there's no button to create a new file, which makes sense. There's neither a button for that in Finder on macOS. But in a command line, you have a command called touch, which basically if you type touch and then the name of the file you want, like say test.xml, it will create a file called test.xml within the current folder you're in. And that will create an empty file, which then you can open, for example, in Textor. You see how it all fits together? And then you can type anything you want. The main use case for me at the moment with OpenTerm is really creating any file I want. I don't need to open a certain app to create an XML file. I can just say within OpenTerm, touch my file dot whatever extension I want, and it will create an empty file with that name and extension, which is kind of nice.
It's been a while since I'm not as familiar with Terminal. Or is file merging a thing that's a command, or I know deletion is definitely a thing?
The way command line interfaces work is that there's a bunch of tools, most of them being open source, that are bundled inside a terminal. OpenTerm at the moment has about, I think, 30, maybe 40 different commands. File merging as you mentioned, is not one of those at the moment, but there are certain commands out there that provide that for file merging. So it might be interesting to add those. It's really nice to see, all the open source work coming together. Like you have an open source terminal using open source commands, and kind of nice actually. That's the great thing actually about OpenTerm being open source. Anyone with a need for a certain command can go on GitHub, github.com/louisdh/terminal. It's actually called still, the repo. And there they can provide, feedback or maybe propose actually a command to be added. So if someone really wants a command added to OpenTerm, they can add it themselves and request me to merge that into the App Store app.
Very cool. One of the commands is SSH. This is for remoting in the servers, is that right? What kind of access does that grant you?
Right. So SSH in OpenTerm is currently quite limited, unfortunately, because the real power with SSH is that you connect to a server. And once you have a connection established, you can then execute commands on that server. So for example, you could connect to a Linux server, and then you can manipulate the files on that remote machine and display them and do anything you want with them. Unfortunately, SSH at the moment in OpenTerm is not interactive, which means if you execute a command SSH, it can only do the commands that you pass to it when you type it. When you want to create a file via SSH in OpenTerm, you can say SSH and then the server and then the command you want, and it will do that command. But if you want to do another command, you have to always re-enter the server name. You need to create a new connection every time you want another command.
And that's a limitation of iOS APIs currently?
Not really, actually. There are some SSH applications in the App Store that allow far more rich experience with SSH. It's just that the text management within OpenTerm is not ideal at the moment for an interactive environment.
Okay.
Where you create a connection with a server and type basically on a remote machine. So there's some work needed there, and luckily it's open source and some volunteers have taken it on them to improve on that, which is kind of nice to see.
Oh, very cool.
Hopefully in an update it will improve in OpenTerm.
And FTP access is currently not an ability, right? That could be added in the future though through the developer community.
In the coming updates, FTP might be included.
Oh, very cool. Yeah.
So we're looking at that, as well as commands like ping, which you can use to check the connection to a certain site or server, which is kind of nice. So yeah, some network commands are definitely coming.
And are there any limitations that you expect to be lifted in the future that would enable the terminal app to do more than you're allowed to currently?
The next big update of OpenTerm will be a scripting update, which will allow you to write scripts, which will then be allowed within those scripts to call any command you want. So let's say you want to create 1,000 files or 1,000 folders, then you can write a for loop within a script and actually do it in an efficient manner rather than having to tap a button in the UI 1,000 times and typing the name.
This could also do batch renaming maybe as well in a similar scripting method?
Yeah, probably. Yeah. And so the real challenge at the moment with scripting inside OpenTerm is that Apple does not allow applications within the App Store to execute arbitrary code. And basically what that means is when a developer creates an app, when you go and upload the app to the App Store, the whole application is signed cryptographically, and all the code that's within the app at the time of uploading is signed as well. And that's the only code that's allowed to be executed. It's not allowed at the moment by Apple to add more features, you could say, or in this case, have scripts that actually go and run native code at native speed and do certain things. So one way to get around that is use what's called an interpreter, which basically is a higher level way of running code, which is not as powerful, not as fast. It'll do for scripting in OpenTerm.
Yeah.
But and that's, by the way, also limiting, if we go back to Xcode on iOS, the reason that there aren't many powerful IDEs at the moment is that Apple does not allow, code execution. So if you type code in an app on iOS at the moment and you execute it, it's not really being executed at full speed. It has some limitations. It's being run within this sandbox thing, and and if it crashes the code, it will bring down the whole app, which is kind of nasty. Yeah. So it would be nice if Apple would open that a bit more up and allow more powerful scripting or IDEs on iOS with, I don't know, certain permissions that maybe developers can ask for.
Yep. That's the same rule that prevents video game emulation from being an app that's available, for instance.
Right, indeed. Yeah.
With Textor, are there any other features on its way? It's got dark mode now. It's got different font sizes. But beyond that, it's text editing, and I'm not sure if there's anything else to do to it.
Yeah, so the reception to Textor was quite amazing. So thanks to everyone who downloaded it and for all the kind feedback, as well as all the news sites that wrote about it. And I got a lot of feedback regarding features as well. When I released the 1.0 version, one of the many requested features was adding a dark mode. Because Textor is also open source on my GitHub profile, someone actually created a dark mode and uploaded it and said like, hey, maybe you should add this to the app. And I did. And so a couple of days later, there was a dark mode. So that was one feature ticked off. Another feature people really wanted in version 1.0 and was added was the text size. So you can change the font size. But that's kind of where it stopped at the moment. Mm-hmm. Other features that people have requested and I'm looking into is changing actually the font. So currently you can change the font size, but not the font itself. It's always the same font.
That would be nice.
And so it might be interesting to allow people to change, the font to something they like. Although obviously it's not all the files within Textor are plain text. So if you change the font or the text size, it's not within the file that you're changing that because it's plain text.
Right.
You're changing it on an app level. So all the files you open have the same font then that you pick in the settings.
Okay. What was the inspiration for the name, the icon, and going with purple as kind of the color highlighting and scheme of it?
I actually wrote a blog post about the icon that I designed for Textor. I wanted the app to be very simple, which I think I succeeded in, but I also wanted the app icon to reflect the simplicity of the app. Initially, I was going for like a really basic icon with the letter T, which was kind of lame looking back now. I then went completely the other side. I made it very complex with like a keyboard within the icon. But eventually I settled on the current icon, which has basically a file glyph, you could say. And yeah, the purple, it was just playing around in Photoshop with different colors until it felt right. So not much of a story behind the color, I'm afraid.
Yeah. One interesting feature I was just thinking of is some apps I know offer alternate colored icons. And having like a bunch of variety of icons people could pick out. I don't know how easy or hard that is. I'm not a developer. I know it's a feature now with iOS.
People have requested a similar feature, or actually the same feature regarding different app icons within OpenTerm. And as well in Textor, there are arguments you can make against and for it. Like, sure, some people might like that, but then again, is there really much of a benefit to change the icon of a plain text editor? I'm not sure.
Yeah, just people wanting their devices to be in a certain color scheme. It's really not a functional benefit at all. Yeah.
So I'm not sure what the idea would be behind it. Like, I don't know, provides like 16 icons in Textor, like each a different color, like you would have a red and a green and a blue. I don't know. Maybe might be useful to someone, but I'm not sure if I will add that.
For Pixure, this is a pixel-based artwork creation tool. This is your first app. Did you create this because you, in your day job, need to create pixel-based art, or what was the motivation for this app being made?
That was a complete hobby project that I started when I was still in college a couple of years ago. The main inspiration initially for Pixure was the drawings that Susan Kerr made for the Macintosh project back in the 80s, which back then pixel art were just called art, right? because of the resolution being so low on the initial Macintosh, as well as the display being black and white, so it didn't have any color. It was really fun a couple of years ago to watch a presentation by Susan Kerr. Maybe we should link to it in the show notes or something, where she talked about designing these icons, which is basically pixel art. She was using just black on white pixels. It's like, well, you can still see the remnants of those icons today, like the Finder icon she designed, I believe, and things like that. That was the main inspiration. Like, I saw that presentation and I wanted to draw pixel art on my iPad and didn't find a good app at the time. So I decided to create one. And within a matter of, a couple of days, I had a black on white grid where I could just draw some pixels, which was such a nice feeling. And many months later, I eventually got to release Pixure, which was a full-featured pixel art editor with colors and things like that.
Very cool. My brain immediately went to 8-bit artwork in like Mario and things like that. But yeah, app icons back in the early days. It's fascinating. Have you gotten much feedback from users as far as artwork created in Pixure? Have you seen some cool things being made with it?
People send me some artwork from time to time that they create in Pixure, which is great to see. I haven't seen any games yet that have used artwork created in Pixure, but if anyone did create a game, I would love to hear. So please tell me if you did, if someone's listening.
What one of your favorite features in the app?
Back in December of last year, I launched Pixure 3.0, which was a big update. One of the more interesting features in that update was actually a version browser, which is basically comparable to Time Machine on macOS, where you can select a document and it will open this 3D view where you can browse through all the different versions since you started creating the document. It's basically a history of the drawing. And you can go back and export older versions if you made a mistake or maybe you liked it better before you made a change. That's a really nice feature to also sort of think about, like, well, wouldn't it be nice to have that as a system feature, to have it maybe in the Files app as well?
Yeah.
That was a lot of fun working on. And so, yeah.
That could be useful for doing multiple steps in an animation of a character. Say you have a character, then you make some adjustments for the slight movement of that character.
Yeah, people have been requesting actually some animation features in Pixure, which I haven't got around to yet, but that will be a lot of fun to work on, I think. Pixel art as a static image is one thing, but actually having animations and movements with pixel art is a lot of fun to see and also work at, I believe.
Anything else about Pixure that we didn't cover that you want to talk about?
Together with Pixure 3.0, I actually launched PanelKit 2.0 as well last December. PanelKit 2.0 mainly introduced the ability to resize panels, and that was quite some tinkering and some prototyping involved to get that right, because as I've mentioned before, actually resizing what are essentially windows, although you can call them panels, is quite tricky with a touch interface. And so eventually I went for a sort of handle in the right bottom corner of each panel where you can drag and resize each panel. But yeah, there was some prototyping involved. At one point I had like a double tap gesture on the title of the panel, which would enter a resize mode, and you can pinch to resize. And some crazy stuff. That was a lot of fun as well to work on.
The other question I have, Savannah Kit. What is this, I guess, resource or tool that you've developed?
As I've said, I'm looking for the next OpenTerm update to bring scripting to OpenTerm, which will actually be using a programming language that I created myself called CUB, C-U-B, that's spelled. Having a programming language and a terminal is one thing, but you need actually a good environment to write the code in. Have an idea about how to debug it if there's anything wrong with it. And so I went and created a framework called SavannahKit, which has a bunch of building blocks within it for having a UI to display and edit code.
Okay.
And so the main building block at the moment is a text view, which basically displays the code, and it has syntax highlighting, so different attributes have different colors within it. You can have auto-completion and things like that to easily write code efficiently.
Okay. And with your code, Linus and Cub, your development languages, I mean, what were the objectives in creating those, and why use something custom versus just pure Swift or some other language?
About 18 months ago, I had the idea of having a shader kind of feature within Pixure, which basically allows you to write code that then is reflected on the pixels that you see on screen. So you can write code that says, well, I want every other pixel to be red, and then you would have like a tile pattern of red, white, something like that, or maybe gradients, stuff like that. At the time, I was considering like maybe I can use JavaScript. That's one option on iOS, which is kind of built in the system, which wouldn't require too much work. But then I thought it would be a fun learning exercise to actually create my own language and my own compiler and stuff like that. And so I went ahead and did actually that. So as I said, it's a fun learning exercise, not necessarily the fastest way that I could have developed such a feature. It's kind of embarrassing, though, that as we speak, that feature, that shader feature in Pixure is not yet finished. It's still not out there in the App Store, although I'm working on it.
Sounds like a cool feature once it gets polished up.
Yeah, but then kind of interesting how things went, because then like a year later, after I created Linus, I started working on OpenTerm.
Yeah.
And I was thinking like, well, I want scripting. Should I use JavaScript? Well, no, I know how to create a programming language now. So maybe I should create a programming language specifically for scripting in OpenTerm, which I did. And that's CUP, which is based in its implementation on Linus, although it has some richer features that you need to do scripting, which you don't necessarily need in a shader language. It's always interesting looking back how time goes. If I hadn't created Linus, I probably wouldn't have created CUP, which would then mean there's no scripting in OpenTerm.
Yeah. Well, anything else we haven't covered that you'd like to talk about for a little bit?
WWDC is coming up.
Yeah. Did you put in the request for the lottery, or what's?
I did register for the lottery, but I was not lucky enough to get a ticket, unfortunately. So yeah, maybe next year. I did go last year though. So hey, I have something, I suppose.
Yeah. What's the one big thing you're hoping to see? Is this Mac iOS shared codebase thing something you're excited about, or what are you looking forward to, hoping to see announced?
There are some rumblings surrounding cross-platform applications on iOS and macOS, which might be the first step to having maybe mouse support or better window management on iOS. So it'll be interesting to see what Apple comes up with and what they see as the next step for iPad or iOS in general.
Yeah, I can't wait to see what gets announced.
Yeah, and maybe I can bring Pixure to the Mac if the rumors turn out.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Lewis, this morning or afternoon for you. And for people that want to find your work, it's at silverfox.be. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this episode of iPad Pros. It would mean the world to me if you could spend just a few minutes right now to open up the Apple Podcasts app if you're not already in it, and leave a review for this show. Just search for iPad Pros and Apple Podcasts. It would be greatly, greatly appreciated. It helps others discover the podcast, and you'd have my thanks. You can find the show notes over at iPadPros.net. You can email me, iPadProsPodcast@gmail.com. And with that, thanks for listening to this episode of iPad Pros.